There is a bread that the modern world forgot. Not recently, not gradually. It was taken from us all at once in a single decade when a pair of brothers from Austria arrived in Cincinnati in 1868, built a factory, and began selling something that had never existed before: yeast in a packet. Fast, reliable, cheap. And with it, they made 200 years of a different tradition feel unnecessary overnight. The bread I am talking about does not need their yeast. It never did. It was baking long before those brothers were born, in stone farmhouses in the mountains of West Virginia and Kentucky, in plain Amish homes in Pennsylvania and Indiana, passed from neighbor to neighbor, not as a recipe, but as a living thing, a starter, a culture, something you fed and tended and kept warm through the night, the way you keep anything alive that matters. And here is what nobody tells you. The early church in Jerusalem, as described in Acts chapter 2, broke bread from house to house every single day. Not in a temple, not in a formal building, in homes, around tables. With gladness and simplicity of heart, the scripture says, the bread on those tables was not the bread in your grocery store. It was fermented bread, dense, slow bread. Bread that required time and patience and the kind of faithful, daily attention that looks, if you think about it, a great deal like prayer. The Amish understood this without being told. For them, baking bread was never separate from faith. Before chores, before school, before anything else, the day began with gratitude. And on baking day, that gratitude moved into the hands. The women of those communities kept a fermented starter alive the way the early church kept its practices alive. Not because a book told them to, because it was passed to them, warm, by someone who loved them. Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you is older than the Amish, older than Appalachia. And when you understand where it came from and what it carries, you will never look at a loaf of bread the same way again. To understand this bread, you have to go back, not decades, centuries. Picture the mountains of what is now West Virginia, the western frontier of Virginia, in the 1770s. Small settlements carved from wilderness, stone hearths, clay ovens built against stone walls. Women who knew exactly where the warmest corner of the fire was and what happened when you left a pot of grain near it overnight. No refrigeration, no stores, no packet of anything. If you wanted bread, you understood your kitchen, you understood your heat, and you understood that certain things, left at just the right temperature, would come alive by morning. The earliest written recipe for this bread was recorded in 1778 in Ronceverte, in what was then Virginia's western frontier. But written recipes always come after the tradition. The women who made this bread did not write it down for a long time because it did not need to be written. It was held in hands, passed between neighbors, carried when communities moved. Bakers Genevieve Bardwell and Susan Ray Brown spent decades tracking this bread, interviewing the oldest bakers who still remembered it, and published what they found in their 2016 book, Salt Rising Bread: Recipes and Heartfelt Stories of a Nearly Lost Appalachian Tradition. What they discovered was not just a recipe, it was a lineage. The bread spread through Appalachian communities and into the plain settlements that put down roots in those same mountains and valleys. It reached Amish families in western Pennsylvania, Mennonite communities in Ohio and Indiana, and plain households in Kentucky and New York. In those communities, it held on the longest because people baked from scratch every week without exception. They had to. And in that faithful, weekly necessity, something was preserved that the rest of America threw away the moment it became optional. The connection to Scripture runs deeper than most people realize. In Acts chapter 2, verse 46, the early believers are described as breaking bread from house to house daily with gladness and simplicity of heart. This was not the communion ceremony. This was ordinary bread, baked at home, shared across tables, passed from hand to hand as an act of community and love. Bread was not a side dish in that world. It was the center of the table. It was survival and celebration and fellowship all in one loaf. And the plain communities who carried this fermented tradition understood, in a way the rest of us forgot, that making bread with patience and intention was itself an act of faith worked out in the hands. Here is the part that stopped Bardwell and Brown in their research, and that changed how you understand this bread entirely. In Greece, a bread called eftazimo uses a fermented starter made from chickpeas. In Turkey, karahoyuk, a bread with a tradition researchers trace to the Byzantine era, uses the same three-stage bacterial fermentation method. In Cyprus, a bread called arkatina does the same. In Sudan, gurgoush is built on lentils and milk. These communities had no contact with each other, no contact with Appalachia, no shared history, no record of exchange across any century. And yet Bardwell, after traveling to Greece, Cyprus, and Turkey, and standing in their home kitchens, confirmed something that took her breath away. The starters all smell identical. The fermentation is identical. The three-stage process is identical. Independent communities on different continents, across different centuries, found their way to the same living bread without any way of knowing the others existed. In the faith tradition, we have a word for that kind of convergence: providence. What makes this bread different from the sourdough on the shelf at your grocery store is not marketing, it is microbiology. In 2008, researchers at West Virginia University and the University of Pittsburgh published a study formally describing for the first time what actually happens inside a salt-rising bread starter. What they found is a three-stage fermentation, 3 different families of bacteria working in sequence, each handing off to the next like runners in a relay. First, bacillus species in the early hours, then a middle stage that produces the leavening, then lactobacillus species in the final hours, producing the rich, sharp, almost cheese-like flavor that makes this bread unlike anything else you will ever taste. 3 stages, 3 living populations, working in order, in sequence. Your store-bought sourdough runs on 1 fermentation class. Salt-rising bread runs on 3. Think of it this way. If a sourdough starter is a single voice, salt-rising bread is a choir, each part coming in at the right moment, each one building on what came before, the whole greater than any one of its parts. And it is that layered living process that produces the keeping quality that made this bread so essential to communities that had no refrigerator and no choice. Bardwell and Brown document Appalachian families keeping loaves wrapped in cloth at room temperature for a week or more without any spoilage. Not because they were careful, because the bread itself was built to last. The final fermentation stage creates an internal environment that resists mold naturally, an ancient chemistry that no packet of yeast can replicate, that no industrial process has ever improved on. The researchers also confirmed something that had puzzled bakers for generations. The bread is completely safe. 250 years of continuous baking. Not one documented illness. The bacteria that power this fermentation are non-pathogenic at the genetic level. The communities that bake this bread every week were not taking a risk. They were holding something that the rest of us, in our rush toward convenience, simply did not understand well enough to keep. The Amish women who kept this bread alive understood all of this in their bones, even if they never used the word fermentation. They knew the starter needed warmth, the specific steady heat of a corner near the fire, held through the night without interruption. They knew it needed fresh grain, not old grain. They knew it was ready when it smelled a certain way, sharp and alive and urgent, a smell that anyone unfamiliar with it might mistake for something gone wrong. But the experienced baker knew. That smell was not a warning. It was an announcement. It meant something was alive in that jar, and it was time. Picture a plain farmhouse in western Pennsylvania. Early morning, the winter of 1910 or thereabouts. The kitchen still dark, the fire already lit the way it was every morning before anything else was done. A woman moves quietly from the hearth to the table, lifts the cloth from a glass jar sitting in a pan of warm water, and bends close to smell. What she finds there is sharp and aggressive and alive, closer to the smell of a wedge of old cheese than to anything you would expect from cornmeal. She does not pull back. She does not wonder if something went wrong. She smiles because that smell is the sign she has been waiting for since she set the starter the night before. Her bread is ready to make. Her mother taught her this. Her mother's mother taught her mother. The knowledge was never written down because it did not need to be. It lived in hands and noses and in the quiet confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times before. The jar goes back near the warmth. The fire gets a log. The flour comes out. And somewhere in Indiana that same morning, in Ohio, in Kentucky, in a dozen plain communities that have never spoken to each other women are doing the same thing, reading the same smell, recognizing the same sign, making the same bread. For the Amish, baking bread was worship in the most literal sense, not metaphor. Their spiritual practice describes labor done with humility as an offering, the daily and ordinary made sacred by the heart that brings it. The day began with gratitude before the first task was touched. Bread went into the oven as an extension of that gratitude, and when it came out, it went to the table and to the neighbor and to the sick and to the stranger at the door. The communion service in an Amish congregation uses bread from a large shared round loaf. Each member receives a piece. It is passed. It is broken. It is the same gesture the early church made in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, daily in homes, with gladness and simplicity of heart. Something was held here that the rest of us let go, and now I want to give it back to you. Here is the recipe, as close to the original as you can make it in your own kitchen today. It takes patience. It asks you to pay attention in a way that most modern recipes do not. But it does not require any skill you do not already have, and every ingredient you need is available at a standard grocery store. For the starter, you will need 2 tablespoons of fine white cornmeal. This is the foundation, and freshness matters more than anything else here. The bacteria that raise this bread live on the surface of fresh grain. Old cornmeal, the box that has been sitting in your pantry since last summer, will not work. Buy it new this week. You will also need 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and 1 cup of whole milk. For the bread itself, 3 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of sugar, 2 tablespoons of softened butter, and 1 cup of warm water. Here is what you do. In a glass jar or a heat-safe bowl, combine the cornmeal, baking soda, and salt. Heat the milk in a small saucepan until you see small bubbles forming at the edges, just below a full simmer. Pour it over the cornmeal mixture while it is still very hot and stir well. The heat is doing important work here. It is clearing the field, removing the organisms that would compete with the bacteria you are trying to cultivate, the way a gardener clears weeds before planting something that needs room and light. Now you need to keep this warm, not hot, warm. The target is around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature of a very warm bath. A picnic cooler with a jar of hot water set beside the starter works beautifully. So does an oven with only the oven light switched on, nothing else. A spot near a heating vent covered with a folded towel. Cover the jar loosely and leave it alone for 10 to 12 hours. Do not check it every hour. Do not move it across the kitchen to show someone. Trust it. This is the part that requires the same thing the Amish bakers always brought to this bread: patience and the willingness to let something live on its own terms. In the morning, if the starter has done its work, it will be visibly bubbly and foamy, and it will smell powerfully of aged, sharp cheese. Don't let that smell alarm you. That is not a sign that something went wrong. That is the sign that everything went exactly right. That sharp, aggressive, almost cheese-like smell is the lactobacillus bacteria completing the final stage of their work, producing the same compounds that give Parmesan and aged cheddar their edge. If your starter smells like this and looks alive with bubbles, you are ready. Do not wait. A starter at peak activity will begin to fall within a few hours. Move now while it is alive and eager. Combine the active starter with the flour, salt, sugar, and softened butter in a large bowl. Add the warm water slowly, mixing as you go until the dough comes together. It will be softer and stickier than a yeast dough. And that is exactly right. Do not add more flour trying to stiffen it. This bread is not supposed to feel like what you are used to. Knead it gently for just 2 or 3 minutes, then divide it between 2 greased loaf pans, cover them with a clean cloth, and return them to your warm spot for 2 to 3 hours until the dough has risen slowly and quietly to the rim of the pans. Bake at 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 35 to 40 minutes until the crust is a deep golden brown and the loaves sound hollow when you tap them firmly on the bottom. That hollow sound is how bakers have known for centuries. Not a thermometer, not a toothpick, a tap and an ear that has learned what to listen for. When you lift these loaves from the oven, the smell in your kitchen will be unlike any bread you have ever made. Warm and sharp and layered, like something older than any recipe you have ever followed. Set them on a rack. Let them cool for at least 20 minutes. When you cut the first slice, it will be close-grained and pale, almost velvety in the crumb, with a flavor that sits somewhere between a good loaf of white bread and a sharp aged cheese. There is nothing else quite like it. Slice it thin, butter it while still warm, and pass the first piece to whoever is standing nearest to you. That last instruction is not optional. This bread was never meant to be eaten alone. We live in a world that has given us convenience and taken from us something harder to name. The packet of yeast that replaced this bread in American kitchens was faster, yes, more reliable. It made bread that rose every single time without any particular attention or care. What it could not do, what no packet ever has done, is what 12 hours of patient warmth produces. It could not carry the history. It could not hold the lineage. It could not make the starter that Genevieve Bardwell followed from Appalachian kitchens all the way to the kitchens of Greece and Turkey and Cyprus and Sudan, where women who had never heard of West Virginia were making, by hand and by memory, and by the faithful attention of people who took bread seriously, the same bread. The early church broke bread daily in homes, Acts 2, verse 46. With gladness and simplicity of heart, not in a ceremony, not in a formal structure with programs and printed orders of service, at the table, in the kitchen, from house to house. That practice was not incidental to their faith. It was an expression of it, worked out in the most ordinary act a household performs, the making and sharing of bread. The Amish understood this. The plain women of western Pennsylvania and Kentucky and Indiana who kept a jar warm by the fire every single week understood this. They were not trying to preserve a food tradition. They were living their faith in the kitchen, the same way they lived it in the field and at the table where they prayed before every meal without exception, the same way the early believers in Jerusalem lived it, breaking bread from house to house with gladness and simplicity of heart. What they kept for us was not just a recipe. It was a reminder that some things worth having cannot be rushed, cannot be packaged, cannot be made compatible with a faster pace of life. They require the 10 hours. They require the right temperature. They require the willingness to tend something living and trust that it will do what it was made to do. Buy the cornmeal this week. Set the starter tonight. In the morning, if it smells sharp and alive and like something your grandmother might have recognized, you will know you are holding what women in Appalachia and Turkey and Cyprus and Sudan held before you across centuries they could not have imagined, in kitchens they would never see. The table is set. Come sit down. And if this moved something in you today, if it felt more like a recovery than a recipe, share it with someone at your table this week. A friend who bakes, a family member who needs reminding that the old ways still have something to teach us. Some things are too good to keep to yourself.